Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to get our hands dirty today.
Well, maybe not literally.
True, true. But we are diving into a topic that, let's be honest, most of us would rather not think about. Wastewater treatment.
Yeah, not exactly glamorous dinner conversation.
Definitely not. But it's one of those things that's so essential, so crucial to our health and the environment that we kind of have to talk about it. And we've got a great guide for our deep dive today, this science text called Wastewater Story.
It's actually aimed at learners, which I love, breaks down a pretty complex topic into something everyone can grasp.
Perfect for our deep dives. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's set the stage here. Why should we even care about wastewater treatment? I mean, out of sight, out of mind, right?
Oh, if only it were that simple. The truth is, this stuff is a matter of life or death for a huge chunk of the world's population.
Seriously.
Seriously, we're talking over 1 billion people worldwide who don't have access to safe water. And a lot of that comes down to inadequate sanitation and wastewater treatment.
Over 1 billion. Wow, that's a staggering number.
It is, and it puts into perspective initiatives like the UN's Water for Life decade back in 2005, where they were aiming to cut that number in half. Ambitious goal.
It really is. So how does understanding wastewater treatment, like the nuts and bolts of it, how does that play into solving a problem that massive?
Well, effective wastewater treatment is a huge EE part of the solution. Because essentially we're talking about taking what we flush and drain, stuff we consider waste, and turning it into something safe, and in some cases, even reusable.
Okay, so it's like a giant recycling system for the stuff we'd rather not think about.
Exactly.
All right, I'm starting to get the big picture here, but I got to ask, when we say wastewater, I think most of us picture, what goes down the drain in our homes. But what else gets lumped into that category? Stuff we might not expect.
Oh, it's a real mixed bag. You've got your household stuff, sure, but we're also talking about industrial runoff, think factories and plants, and even rainwater gets pulled into the mix.
Rainwater? I never thought of rainwater as waste.
Right. But it all gets grouped together under this umbrella term, sewage.
Sewage. Okay, now we're getting to the not so pleasant part.
Huh. Right. And this science text wastewater story. It really encourages us to imagine the sights and smells of an open sewer drain to drive the point home.
I think I'll pass on that mental image for now.
Yeah.
But I am starting to see why this is about more than just avoiding something stinky. Untreated sewage sounds like a recipe for disaster.
You got it. It's a breeding ground for all kinds of nasty bacteria and pollutants that can contaminate water sources and spread diseases like crazy.
So like a public health nightmare.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's break down exactly what's in this sewage cocktail that makes it so dangerous.
Well, on the organic side, you've got, food waste, human waste.
Right, I think we can all picture that.
Right, but then you've also got this whole inorganic side.
Yeah.
Chemicals, metals, and even things like nitrates and phosphates.
Wait, nitrates and phosphates? But those are good for plants, right? Why are those considered pollutants here?
They are essential nutrients, absolutely. But too much of a good thing can really throw an ecosystem out of whack.
Ah, so it's all about balance.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the organic gunk, the inorganic stuff. But let's talk about what really makes people squirm. The bacteria. Wastewater Story specifically mentions Vibrio cholerae and Salmonella typhi.
Ah, yes, the culprits behind cholera and typhoid fever. Those are some serious waterborne diseases, especially in areas without proper sanitation.
And if I'm remembering those stats you dropped earlier, that means a significant chunk of the world is at risk.
Sadly, that's the reality. It's a vicious cycle. Lack of sanitation leads to contaminated water, which leads to disease, which makes it even harder to improve sanitation.
It's all connected.
Exactly. And that's why this deep dive into wastewater treatment is so important. We're not just talking about what goes down the drain. We're talking about global health, equity, the whole shebang.
Okay, so we've established that sewage is not something you want hanging around. But once it's, out of sight, down the drain, what happens to it? How do we actually deal with this stuff?
Well, that's where things get really ingenious, actually.
Ingenious? You mean like high-tech solutions? Lasers?
Haha, no lasers this time. Though the technology is pretty impressive, our trusty wastewater story describes the whole system as a kind of hidden city, with pipes and manholes acting like a giant transport network.
So like a network of underground tunnels whisking away all the unpleasantness.
Exactly. Out of sight, out of mind. Right. Well, not quite. Because that network leads to a wastewater treatment plant, and that's where the real magic happens.
Magic? You mean like science and engineering?
Of course.
Yeah.
But honestly, the way these plants transform hazardous waste into something close to clean water is pretty mind-blowing. It's a multi-step process, each one designed to tackle a specific problem.
Okay, walk me through it. What's the first line of defense in this underground battle against grime?
First up, you've got your bar screens. Think of them as the bouncers of the sewage world.
Bouncers?
Yeah, they're basically big metal grates that catch anything too large to flow through. Rags, sticks, you name it, anything that could jam up the works further down the line.
Ah, so they're preventing a massive plumbing disaster.
Exactly. Once that initial debris is filtered out, things slow down a bit as the wastewater enters what's called the grit and sand removal stage.
So heavier particles settle out here.
Yep. Sand, gravel, eggshells, all that stuff that could wear down the equipment later on.
Makes sense. Get the heavy stuff out of the way early.
Exactly. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting. The next step is sludge separation, and this part happens on a slope.
A slope. Way a slope.
It's all about efficiency. The slope encourages the solids, the sludge, to settle at the bottom of the tank where it can be easily removed.
Okay, so we're separating the solids from the liquids. But what do you do with all that sludge?
Well, that's the cool part. Remember all that organic matter we talked about earlier? That sludge is actually a gold mine of nutrients.
Wait, seriously, we're talking about, sludge here.
I know, it sounds kind of gross. But that sludge makes fantastic fertilizer.
So we're going from ew to grow. Sewage helps plants thrive. This is blowing my mind.
It's a perfect example of turning a problem into a resource. But we're not done yet. Next up, we call in the heavy hitters. Aerobic bacteria.
Our microscopic allies in the fight against pollution, I remember Wastewater story mentioned those guys.
Mm-hmm.
They basically feast on whatever organic matter is left in the water, right?
Precisely. They break down the harmful stuff into less harmful byproducts.
And the book uses that analogy of an aquarium aerator to explain how those bacteria get the oxygen they need, right?
Exactly. We pump air into the water, creating the perfect environment for those bacteria to do their thing.
And that thing is cleaning up our mess. So what happens to the bacteria after their big feast?
Well, they become what's known as activated sludge, which also settles to the bottom and can be used as fertilizer.
So 2 types of sludge, both good for the environment. Who knew? But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, what about those harmful bacteria we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
The cholera and typhoid culprits. We can't forget about those guys.
Absolutely not. And that's where the final and arguably most important step comes in. Disinfection.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Got to make sure that treated water is safe to release.
Exactly. And for that, we call in our trusty sidekicks, chlorine and ozone.
Those are the sanitation superheroes, right?
You got it. They wipe out any remaining pathogens, ensuring that the water is safe to release back into the environment.
Wait, seriously? The water that started as, sewage could end up back in rivers and lakes.
It's the circle of life. Wastewater edition. Of course, there are strict regulations and safety standards to ensure that the released water won't disrupt the natural balance of things.
That makes sense. You don't want to solve one problem and create another.
It's
kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, this whole journey from, sewage to water that's actually clean enough to release back into the environment, and we just take it for granted.
It's easy to forget about the complex systems working behind the scenes to make that happen. Out of sight, out of mind, right?
Right. But one thing that really struck me in Wastewater's story is how much our individual actions factor into all of this. It's not just about the technology, it's about us being responsible citizens, even when it comes to what we flush.
Absolutely. It's easy to think, once it's down the drain, it's someone else's problem. But the reality is we have a surprising amount of control over how effectively those treatment plants can do their job.
It's like we're all part of this big team, even if we don't realize it. And Wastewater's story gives some really practical tips for being better teammates. Like they have this whole section on better housekeeping practices, things like never pour cooking oil or fat down the drain.
Oh, that's a big one. Ever heard of fatberg?
A fatberg? That sounds disgusting.
It is. Those greasy masses can clog up pipes in your home, but they can also cause major problems in the sewage system.
Okay. That's an image I could do without.
Yeah. And it's not just about fats and oils. The book also mentions being careful about flushing harmful chemicals, things like paint thinner or pesticides.
Right. Those can't be good for the bacteria doing all the hard work at the treatment plant, right?
Exactly. Those substances can really mess with the biological processes that make the whole system work.
And then, of course, there's the most obvious one, disposing of solid waste properly.
Ah.
Don't even get me started on what people try to flush down the toilet.
Oh, I know, right? It all comes back to collective responsibility. We can have the most sophisticated treatment plants in the world, but if people aren't doing their part on the front end, well, it makes things a lot more challenging.
So what I'm hearing is being mindful of what we flush or pour down the drain isn't just about avoiding a plumbing disaster in our own homes. It's about, like you said, being a responsible part of a much larger system. Now, speaking of larger systems, Wastewater Story doesn't shy away from talking about places where access to proper sanitation is a huge challenge. They specifically mention open defecation, which is still a major issue in parts of the world, especially India.
It's a complex problem, often tied to poverty and lack of infrastructure. But even with those challenges, there are solutions out there.
And the book highlights some of them, like low-cost, on-site alternatives to traditional sewage systems.
Exactly. Things like septic tanks, composting toilets. They even mention something called a vermi-processing toilet.
Vermi.
Vermi-processing. It uses earthworms to break down the waste.
Wow, that's thinking outside the box.
Definitely. And on a larger scale, there are initiatives like India's Swachh Bharat mission, which was launched back in 2016.
Swachh Bharat. Remind me what that translates to again.
Clean India. It's a massive government initiative aimed at improving sanitation and hygiene across the country.
So building toilets, educating people about proper hygiene, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's a multi-pronged approach, tackling the problem from multiple angles.
That's encouraging to hear, because it sounds like a problem that can't be solved with just one solution.
You got it. It takes a combination of individual action, innovative technology, and large-scale initiatives to make a real difference.
You know, it's funny because we started this deep dive talking about something most of us would rather not think about. But this conversation has been surprisingly uplifting.
I agree. It's a good reminder that even something as seemingly mundane as wastewater is actually connected to so many important things. Our health, the environment, even social justice.
It really is all connected, isn't it?
It is.
Well, I think we've all learned a lot today. I know I have.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'll ever look at a manhole the same way again.
Me neither.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
My pleasure.